I'd like to welcome the loyal following for July. Appreciate people following us through the summer. It's the July 21st meeting of the IMAG MSM Working Group on multi-scale modeling and viral pandemics. We have a single speaker today, Nate Jacobs. We're very grateful to him for being willing to come and talk to us today. I need to remind you that, as always, the meeting is live streamed and recorded and archived on YouTube. We have myself, Tom Helikar, Jim Sluka, Lorenzo, and somehow Joel Vannon, whose name should be on this slide, isn't on the slide here. So I apologize for that. Please remember to use our communication channels and help us get the word out, especially in the summer. We need to make sure that we have an audience for our speakers. We appreciate your help with that. We have that Twitter handle, MSM Viral, which people can use to help us create a little bit more identity. If there are any announcements for this week, please feel free to make them. We have our standard steering committee meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. If people feel that they should be invited and aren't, let us know and we'll do our best to get you invited. We have our Google form to suggest speakers. Please remember to fill that out for us and help us come up with a good program for the rest of the summer and the fall. There are a couple of recent papers and NIH RFAs out that people might be interested in. Coming up, we have Surcoat Cola on July 28th, Patrick Kinnunen on August 4th, Nancy Baker on August 11th. If you have suggestions for speakers from July 28th onward, please feel free to suggest yourself, your students, people you'd like to hear from. Please think broadly. We're always interested in topics both directly related to a viral infection and immune response, and more broadly in terms of shared software development, distribution, model infrastructure, standards, engineering applications, and so on. So our speaker today, Nate Jacobs, is going to talk about smaller, faster, better. Got the order wrong. Atomizing research communication with micropublications, which is intriguing for somebody like me who tends to write enormous monolithic articles that hundreds of pages long.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to this very much. So I don't want to take any more of your time. I'll turn the screen share over to you.
Sure. Okay, so let's see here. Let's see here, slideshow. Can you guys all see my screen? Okay, cool. So yeah, so I was asked to give just like a really kind of quick high level overview of kind of what we do and our approach and some kind of discussion points. And so I wanted to we can go through that really quickly. It seems like we'll have quite a bit of time at the end for discussions. And so, you know, I'll just kind of go through and give like a quick 10 to 20 minute overview. And then I'd love to kind of do a deep dive and have a deeper discussion on any points that come up. I can kind of go in a couple different directions depending on what people are interested in chatting about. And then there's also, you know, we're still kind of early in the stage of really experimenting and launching pilots with micropublications. So if there's kind of particular use cases that people would want to sort of brainstorm about, that would also be really interesting. So yeah, so my name is Nate Jacobs. I'm a former systems neuroscientist. Got my PhD at UCI and then was at a postdoc at UCLA, and just got really frustrated with the publishing process and a lot of the you know, the infrastructure of science, meta science topics. And so it just pulled me really hard. I got really sucked into the open science movement, and I just took a really hard left turn, essentially left my research position to pursue intersection of sort of technology and how the business of science, the infrastructure of science, how things are published, how grants are awarded, and things like that. And the main project that I've really focused on in the last few years is flashweb.io, which is a micropublication platform. So I'll do just kind of 3 quick little kind of sections here. First, just go over what is a micropublication and how do we define it, and how are we, kind of what is our take on micropublications. And then second, we can go over one small pilot we did in pandemic informatics with some modeling. I can go into it a little bit. It was semi-successful. It was like partially successful, but I'm still very interested in how micropublications could be used in things like ensemble modeling, and potentially even with some of the multi-skill modeling that you guys are working on. And so I'd love to dive into that. And then I had a few just discussion points, kind of challenges and opportunities, things that that I'm kind of constantly thinking about. I'd be curious to hear your guys' take, and we can kind of use that to open up a broader discussion. Okay, so one of the main things that motivated me to really focus in on micropublications specifically, there's a lot of things that need to be updated and improved in the academic publishing world and lots of aspects of meta-science, but the reason why I got really motivated to focus on micropublications is the amount of work that doesn't get published. So when I was doing my PhD, there was all sorts of really interesting little things that I found. And my PA was just constantly telling me, look, Nate, it's going to take 2 years to turn that into a paper and to get it out. Like, you have to just leave it and stay focused on your thesis, which is good advice. I think in general, focus is good. But when you sit back and look at it, there's just a lot of data and a lot of results that never get published. Some are just things that maybe don't need to be published, but there's a lot of replications. There's a lot of contradictions. I'm sure a lot of you have gone to journal clubs where you're looking at a science paper and you did the similar experiment, but you also ran a couple of controls that maybe showed that result was incorrect. And so there's a lot of results like that that just never get published because they're small, they're tangential, they're not worth the effort to get it over that barrier to get it published in a traditional journal. And what really started nagging at me was this question of what story would those data tell? So would the progress of science be the same? Would we be telling the same stories if there was a much easier way to get some of these smaller chunks and results out? So I've been focusing on how I can sort of define and design a particular publication format that is very, very small, which ends up being kind of the easy step. And then the second step is how do you sort of bring that to life and integrate that into meaningful research communication workflows? But in general, the way that we define a micropublication is a very small, rapidly communicated scientific report. The length we aim for is about the length of a single figure. So it's either a single method or a single result or a single analysis, basically what you would fit in a single figure. And the idea is to not require a lot of narrative for that. So you can have a bit of narrative in there, but you don't need it. It's not a threshold that needs to be crossed for publication. So you could have a method that you're not actually sure what all the applications of it are for. You can list a few, but that's not going to prevent it from getting published. You could have a result or replication. It's not necessarily this earth-shattering result, but it's very rigorous and robust. So the kind of the mental model is we want to publish a brick as opposed to a straw house. So you don't necessarily need to know what structure or what narrative that's going to fit into, but you do want to have a lot of scientific rigor and quality control around the thing that you are communicating. So looks fairly familiar. So you have a title as well as a claim. So each, I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but each micropublication is structured around a single claim. Like I was saying, a single method or a single, something's correlated or a causal claim. Single figure up to 5 panels, and then the text of it should read like a section of the result section. So again, kind of just really focused on the results, and you don't necessarily need a long introduction or discussion section. And then making sure there's really comprehensive links out to all the data, code, and protocols. we are also very focused on making sure that we are a Diamond OA platform. So in addition to the just kind of the non-financial barriers to getting these long articles out, the fact that you're having to pay $5,000-$10,000 to get your PDF, peer reviewed and up on some of these journals, to me is again just this like huge barrier that is preventing a lot of scientific discourse. And so you have a lot of really meaningful discourse happening on Twitter or on discussion threads, and really a lot more of that should be formalized in the scholarly literature. So we're really committed to making sure that it's free. And then we also have a strong focus on making sure the content is machine friendly. And I'll get into that in a bit more in the next slides. Okay, so as I just said in the previous slide, a defining characteristic of a micropublication is that you sort of ejected a lot of the narrative. You don't need that narrative. And it could be sort of a result that's floating out on its own, but is very rigorous and solidly supported. And so now the hard part is, how do you now build up a research narrative? Because it's hard for a community to know what's going on or where the consensus, if there isn't some form of research storytelling. And so what we've really focused on is how can we connect micropublications back up into a research narrative. And this is still very much something that we're working through and challenges us. And I think in different fields and different contexts, it manifests in different ways. And so this is would be a great point of conversation after I'm done chatting. But in general, we describe it as emergent narrative. So instead of a single lab publishing a paper where they have that full narrative, and obviously nobody thinks it's the end of the story there, but you're essentially creating what the full narrative is. So instead, with micropublications, we are facilitating that narrative to emerge across multiple publications. So, one example that we experimented with early on was, point estimate. So infection fatality rate. What is, you can basically get a lot of people to make IFR estimates. And if there's the right metadata and the right structure for that, you can co-visualize those. So you see consensus emerging as the publications kind of pile in. So that's the crux of that research storytelling component that we're going after, is how do we facilitate community-driven consensus narratives. And so each individual micropublication can happen rapidly, but that sort of community consensus around what is true or what's not true, or legitimate forms of disagreement should emerge at the community level. And so just one other example here, not a specific example, just in general, a lot of times you'll have kind of competing camps that will be making competing claims. And a lot of times when you dig into that, there's different parameter spaces under which they're operating. So maybe it's a different like animal model, or a different, just a different set of parameters. And so both camps could actually be very true within their existing parameter space. So by co-visualizing things, you can much more clearly delineate where there is consensus or where there's true differences in different findings and results. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but we basically have like an RDF triple style claim that we try to include in every single micropublication. We've fiddled with a bunch so that if you don't have like a formal causal or correlative assertion, you can make a single item claim, which is just, so let's say you have a method that's about a particular thing. It can essentially collapse down to something that looks more like a keyword, but we do want to have a single claim in every single micropublication. And the reason for that is that we use the claims for the co-visualization and the data visualization and the research storytelling. So instead of a figure in which a single author can sort of kind of pick the results and make a plot for this, we actually want it to be inclusive and be driven by the claims that authors are making. And then if a claim that an author is making is not valid, then that needs to be fleshed out at the peer review stage, not at the the curation stage. And the goal here is to create a decentralized, sort of organic, bottom-up structure for seeking consensus or understanding emerging topics and things that are coming out of a particular community. So if I had to sort of summarize super high level, what really drives us is it's how do we tell research stories? So when you look at different platforms, at different technologies, you take something like Twitter, they have created a particular workflow, content workflow, network workflow that caters to a particular type of story. A lot of times it's very bad, like, you get mobs and things like that, but it does a very specific thing, and the structure of that platform is kind of designed around that. And so we want to do that same sort of thing, but really focus on research storytelling. So how can we tell larger emergent research stories where individual researchers are publishing individual bits as opposed to trying to coalesce it into a single narrative. And yeah, there's obviously a lot of ways to take this, and we're kind of excitedly experimenting with different ways that can manifest. Okay, so that's just super high level overview of the types of kind of approaches we have and what micropublications are. Okay, so a few things with just kind of more specific to pandemic informatics. We had a very first pilot was in 2020, and we had a journal that has since been sunsetted, but was called Outbreak, and we did some initial pilots and experiments with micropublications. One that I was really excited about, but didn't quite catch on, but I just wanted to talk about it very quickly, was city level outbreak models. So we were working with researchers that were modeling, they were basically doing, 2 and 4 week forecasts for, I believe it was primarily cases and deaths, but at the city level, so city and county level. And so the idea there was to integrate more kind of boots on the ground type information. So if you were in San Diego, you could incorporate into your model much more specific details around, like movement data or city level or county level policies or specific cases, and just more contextual information. You could have a better curation of the data. Anyways, yeah. So this was one example where we were experimenting with this idea of model aggregation, and this is one thing that if there's anybody on the call, or if you're watching the recording of this and want to ping me on Twitter afterwards, this is a kind of an open line of investigation that is sort of hasn't been fully, I think, experimented with, and I think there's a lot of room for additional experimentation and piloting here. Because the basic idea here is that the micropublication can capture individual contributions into an ensemble model or some larger model that's aggregating and pulling in results from a bunch of lower level models. And again, what that does is that allows for a much looser, more decentralized, bottom up generation of content. And if it's well structured, can still very easily and seamlessly pool into ensemble models or other models of aggregation. So obviously, a much more successful example of this was the COVID-19 Forecast Hub. There was a couple others as well. I think Midas was supporting some. Katrina Shea had a couple of really interesting ensemble models. And so what was really interesting for me about these projects was that it was a very successful demonstration of the type of thing that I was going for with micropublications. They weren't actually micropublished. The contributions were done, on GitHub, and it was very, very tailored to the specific projects at hand. But in my mind, this looked a lot like micropublications and this building of research narratives across a lot of groups that weren't necessarily connected before COVID. Everybody kind of rallied around and started, tinkering with their own models, and then they got kind of aggregated and pulled in, and led to very robust ensemble models. And so part of what I am driving at and trying to look into is, could we kind of generalize and scale these types of workflows so that the operational costs of doing something like this are much, much lower, so we could do these types of ensemble models for a lot of different diseases when there's not this like massive COVID spotlight and there's a lot of money getting poured onto them. So I just wanted to kind of mention that. Wanted to quickly touch on what our current activities are. So as I said, we sunsetted that Outbreak journal, which was really focused just on pandemic informatics and infectious disease modeling. The next journal that we're piloting is called Data, and it's going to be specific to data science. It's going to be focused a bit more on early career researchers, so early graduate students, master's students, and potentially even some undergraduate work. And this is something that Lucas has been working with me on. He's one of the he's the editor-in-chief for this journal, and that's going to be launching. We're going to do a soft launch kind of end of this year, and then seek to grow it in 2023. But we are going to have a pandemic informatics kind of thread there, and so we're going to be supporting a particular project in this domain. And so if anybody's interested in getting involved with that, let me know. Okay, so that's sort of the quick and dirty take. I have kind of additional slides, or can just verbally go into more detail. For example, if anybody's interested in kind of the peer review or the different types of the data visualizations, we can go into that. But just to throw out a couple of discussion points that we can pick up on. Like I said, I am really interested in continuing to talk with different research groups and different use cases and pilots in infectious disease modeling. I'm not the most familiar with the multi-scale modeling, but that has the same sort of feel as the ensemble modeling, that I think there could be some really interesting potential pilots with how that information is getting shared and integrated across the different levels. And again, using micropublications to formalize those contributions so that you can get potentially more input and more kind of organic and serendipitous contributions from a larger pool of researchers across the globe. So yeah, would be curious to talk to anybody if anybody has any points there. Second point, how can emergent narratives advance individual careers? So I didn't go too deeply into this. This is more kind of on the policy, open access, open science, larger movement, but a large problem and bottleneck for a lot of any sort of disruption of the traditional academic publishing space is how do you manage the incentive structure? So there's just really strong incentive structures for publishing in specific journals. And there's, preprints are definitely more of a thing now, which is awesome. But there's still a lot of incentive structure issues. And so one of the things that we really focused on is how can we strategically kind of approach micropublications and the way that people use micropublications to actually advance their career. And so just one quick point here, the traditional publishing model is more like publishing a New York Times article. It's more like you get this really big career advancement payout at some later date. So you're investing a lot, you're keeping a lot of stuff more private, and then you get this big payout when you get your Nature paper or your Science paper or whatever it is. The model that we're going for is more of an organic bottom-up career advancement mode where you have this continuous drip, rapid communication of things coming out, and each one is not gonna, you can put a few on your CV, but it's not like it's gonna, you're gonna become famous for any one micropublication. But through active leadership and guidance and continuing to basically lead communities down particular lines of inquiry, you can basically establish your reputation and advance your career in that way. But this is sort of a novel way of doing it, and it's not necessarily something that's discussed in tenure and career advancement committee meetings. But that's another track that we're investigating and experimenting with. We're also doing some experiments with funder integration. I'm also a founder of another nonprofit org called Science Fund, and they're working on something called acceleration funding that can use rapid communications as part of the application process. So instead of applying for the grant, you just rapidly publish your work down a particular trajectory, and then the funder can come in and accelerate that and basically allow you to scale it up and hire more people to continue that line of work. And then a fourth thing I listed here, which it gets a bit over my head in terms of the deeper statistical theory and things like that. But there's a lot of situations in which we found micropublications shifting how we approach things, even things like statistical significance and how you do evidence accumulation. And there's a lot of really interesting points there that I'd love to kind of chat about if anybody here is interested in that. I won't go into more detail on that, but yeah. So that's basically what I have. And again, we can basically kind of go off in different directions depending on what people are interested in talking about. But yeah, just going to end with this slide here. You can connect with me on Twitter at NateSJacobs or email me. My email's down here at the bottom here. We're going to be launching that data science journal, in the next 6 months. So, we're trying to fill out the editorial board. There could be some really interesting collaborations with, if you have a pandemic-related data set, we can help do kind of cross promotion for that and get people to micropublish around that. So like using and reusing the data and analyzing it. That's one thing we can do. And if there's any other collaborative efforts or events, we'd be happy to work with anybody on that. I don't know if there's any developers here, but we're also continuing to build out our development team and code base. We're also doing experimentation with some Web3 stuff and centralization and DAOs. And on the more theoretical side, just in terms of actual research, love to, if anybody here is interested in doing some, even if they're not formal pilots, but just more theoretical work on how micropublication could be used in ensemble model workflows and MSM workflows, but also just kind of in a more general level metadata standards and how you can create positive incentive structures for more structured data and more comprehensive metadata. And that ties into like reproducibility and things like that. So, okay, so I'll stop talking now, and we can kind of pick up on some of these threads depending on what people are interested in talking about.
I have several misunderstandings.
Sure.
I'm not ashamed of. First of all, the micropublications appearing anywhere? Are they edited? If not, are they edited by you in some way?
Yeah, so let me just talk through
maybe another point. I'm very intrigued by the word that you used, movement. And maybe you can elaborate. You probably alluded to this a bit, but
what was the word? The word was
movement is exciting.
Okay, so let me just quickly walk through the peer review process. So we do post-publication peer review, which means that when a micropublication, so an author can control when the micropublication goes live on the site in the same way that a preprint can go live on the site, basically as soon as the author clicks it, with just a bit of, if it's out of scope or if it's totally bogus, like the editors can come and just like knock it away. But in general, most things will just get on there immediately with a big banner that says this is under review. And then there's a process of facilitating that post-publication peer review. This is also an area of experimentation for us, but the way that we've been planning right now is you essentially still go out and are having to email and engage people to come and review that, but it's open, right? So anybody can come in and review it. They can flag things and basically provide the review. And then there's, while it's under review, that content is malleable and can be edited, right? So as comments come in, or if things get flagged, let's say they link to the wrong GitHub repo or whatever it is, or they overstated things, they can kind of dial back the language. It'll be malleable while that's happening. And then there is a criteria for when it passes from in review to being kind of accepted for a review. And this is a criteria that kind of depends on the community and the situation. The lowest bar that we've done is essentially do 3 of your peers endorse it to be accepted for publication. That's kind of on the lower end. And then on the higher end, you can basically increase that number and or require an editor to look across all the reviews and endorsements that have come in and make a judgment call as to whether or not it should be accepted or not. We've kept that deliberately vague because it's something that we're going to have to titrate up and down depending on the editorial board's standards, right? So there are certain situations, like if you're doing something that's more of a fishing expedition and you're just trying to get people to publish like different methods or different hot takes, that's something where you can maybe have a little bit of a more inclusive criteria for some of that. If it's something where you're really trying to prove causal assertions and things like that, you want to have a much higher bar. And so that's something that's going to need to be fiddled with based on the on which journal it is that we're launching and what the community is. But that's the gist of it. There's a few other things I can mention there, but I won't go into those details. So you mentioned there was a second part of the question though, Itamar. It was, you said something about movement or excitement. Can you just reiterate that question for me real quick?
Well, I think movement comes from observation of waste in society at large and trying to correct it. It's like you find an opportunity that society is neglecting, and you start a movement, you want to repair it, correct it, improve on it, etc., etc. For example, politics in science and in funding, you can start a movement to help the underdogs.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, in general, I feel like that kind of resonates with some of what we're trying to do here. I think part of the strategy with taking on kind of the traditional publishing kind of system is to focus on areas where micropublications could be more useful, so or immediately useful. So, like I said, there's a lot of research that never gets published, so that's something that we can kind of target and go after, and then kind of slowly build towards, long term. What would be really exciting for me is if we have a very well established incentive structure for advancing your career with this more organic kind of real time active leadership with many rapid communications. That is one path to go, and then you also have the traditional journal path. And so when you find an exciting result, I have this, you can sort of imagine, you can choose which path you go down, right? You can either start kind of really like closing down and trying to secure your provenance for a larger story, and then you're going to have to kind of go and do most of that work on your own, but then you'll get most of the credit. Or you can kind of go down this other path of actively leading a much larger collaborative effort of researchers that are going to get to the answer faster. You're not going to get all the credit, but you might get credit for taking a leadership role there. And so that's not directly answering your question, but you are correct in that there needs to be kind of a movement around this, because a lot of what we're asking researchers to do is a bit of a jumping off of a cliff moment, right? Where there are opportunity costs. And so part of where I try to differentiate myself is being really open and honest about the fact that this isn't just, you can't just like, everybody like pass the peace pipe and everybody's just going to start openly, rapidly sharing everything. Like, you really need to be thoughtful about what the incentive structures are. And, individual researchers are trying to get the next grant so that they can, have money for their graduate students, and they have money for themselves and their own research programs. And so, you have to figure out how to play that game. And I think, looking further down the road, I don't think that we are trying to necessarily directly compete with journal articles. I think we're a fundamentally different kind of pillar of research communication. And so where I'm hoping to push this, 10, 20 years or so, is to have more and more journal articles, the things that take longer to do and are an accumulation of much more results, to be more review articles and to have less and less original research in them. And so maybe there's a bit of original analysis, but to have most of the original first look at the raw data be either micropublications or preprints. And in that way, you still have journal articles in the same way that you still have books. They just serve different purposes, and you're pushing that first look and the effect that result can have on the community to earlier and earlier in the publication life cycle. So yeah, I don't know if I completely answered your question, but
I'll continue it a bit on technical level, although I'm not technical. You mentioned narrative, and I understood that the narrative may be missing in those papers. So it's more like very raw collection of facts or findings. And the question, because you're dealing with huge number, are you using NLP to decipher this or to collect this more automatically?
So
and are you building the narrative in case it's missing?
Yeah. So in terms of how the pieces kind of get connected, so most of the people working in this space are working on NLP and things like that to extract claims from. So they're just the input is either existing articles or they're just having people write the articles and then doing extraction. I have taken sort of the opposite tack, and this is something that I don't know. It's I don't know. It's not necessarily controversial, but it's definitely like unique in that I'm pretty committed to having the author at time of authoring be engaged with the claim. So we've taken a trade-off where we're willing to reduce the structure and the ask that is associated with the amount of structure in the claim. We're willing to actually reduce that quite a bit to get to the point where authors are willing to actually engage with that. So I would much rather have a less structured, less complete claim and metadata, but that is authoritative from the author, so that there is more trust in that narrative when you start putting those pieces together than if you just had a script or an AI that is maybe doing a pretty good job. But I feel like at least for the next 10, 20, maybe 30 years, I think there's going to be hesitation around just accepting whatever some algorithm pulls out of an article as true, right? There's, whether it's, not properly understanding the social context around a publication, like maybe everybody knows that paper is wrong and it just hasn't been retracted because journals don't like to retract things, or maybe it isn't considering a larger set of data. And so there's a lot of processing that happens with, researchers actually formulating what their conclusions are based on the evidence they're presenting, but also the social and the larger context of their work. And so I want them to be involved in that process of creating that claim. And so our claims are going to be not as good and not as structured because we'll have to retreat back to a level that is people are able to interact with. But I do feel like that's important. And so this is just something that kind of came from myself, and I just am very passionate about that for some reason. I'm not, I'm not 100% sure why. I think it's just, kind of what I described. And so that is sort of how they get connected, though, is using the claims algorithmically to then connect them. But the claims themselves are generated by the authors. And so, for that city example, when people are publishing their models, they had to indicate, what model they were using, what city they were modeling, and then that allowed us to just then suck it in and plot it on the visualization.
Great. Jim, you've been very patient, but Hayden had a very specific follow-up to this question, which is short. So let's let him ask his first, and then Jim, and then it was Tom, wasn't it, who had his hand up?
Yeah, hi Nate. I came in a little bit late, but I'm very interested in this model of kind of quicker publication with the sort of public editing process.
Yeah.
My question, though, you talked a little bit about the public review process, but have you given any thought to what the procedures surrounding retraction might be? Because there's sort of historically been an issue. I mean, like you said, with publications not wanting to issue retractions, but also with once the information is out there, what do you actually do about it? And now it's occurring to me that this may be compounded by the fact that you may now have several versions of, a paper that ended up needing to be retracted.
Yeah. I think the first step is to not version everything immediately. So having that period where it's like under review, and then that is basically just like a milieu of like changes happening. And so like, you're not like versioning and needing to retract anything there. And so, but there, you can play with that, right? Like depending on how much engagement there is, that might take shorter or longer, but I think that captures like typos and like all that kind of low level stuff and like really egregious things. And then after that, I think that there should be a much healthier, lower barrier for retraction, right? I think that micropublications in general, the idea is to lower the threshold. So there's less like intensity and less at stake, right? It's like, just get the result out there. I mean, you want it to be you want your claim to be very, very well supported, but your claim can be very, very narrow and small, right? It can be just like, this is a method. I'm not claiming anything else other than it being a method. But given that, I feel like, I would love to be part of a movement that normalizes retraction, and you see a bit of it here and there on Twitter. People have Twitter threads where their paper gets retracted and then they'll provide the context for it. And I really appreciate when that happens, because I feel like that's a very important part of the scientific process. Nobody's right all the time, and sometimes new information comes to light, or sometimes you realize a graduate student or an undergrad did something and it's like, okay, we need to retract this because it's not right. And it does not happen. And I think it comes from authors not wanting to do it, but also comes from negligence from the journals themselves. They don't want their impact factor to get affected. They don't want to be seen as a journal where there are retractions, and it's just, yeah, there's really bad incentives right now around retraction. And so, yeah, and it's still there, right? Like when you retract a paper, it still can be part of the scholarly record, but just appropriately contextualized as most people think this is so egregious that it's just not even true anymore. And we just need to have a big, like, in the same way we can have that in review label, we can have like, this is retracted, but it's, yeah, you don't want to actually remove it from the scholarly record. You want to add a layer on top that says like, this has been basically rejected or basically been, you know, and so I think I got off track there a little bit. What was the second part of the question?
No, I was just curious about what your thoughts were on the retraction process. I mean, I think that the model lends itself well to retracting things because it's public from the start. And the idea that something can be retracted is kind of always out there, as opposed to it being a mistake that has to be admitted.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that it's a very interesting model. I'm looking forward to seeing more.
Yeah, and I guess the one other thing that's somewhat related to that is, it's, I guess, maybe a little more on the peer review side, but you can also have replication be a much more formal part of that state change. So you can have under review, accepted, you know, the review accepted in terms of like, there's nothing wrong here about what they did, but then in terms of like, if you're incentivizing and making it easy for people to actually replicate those results, then you can have another state change where there is consensus that this claim or this result has been replicated. And so that's kind of going in the opposite direction of retraction, where you actually over time, actually, there's enough accumulation where like this result has been replicated. And I feel like that at some point could become like the ultimate level of peer review where people actually took the time to replicate it and, you know, it actually worked. And so, yeah, there's sort of this continuum that I think is interesting to think about.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
Jim, you've been very patient.
It's an interesting idea. I wonder about, I mean, it's attractive to say that you're going to condense things down into a single triple. The problem with a single triple is that it loses context. So the example you gave of SARS-CoV-2 going to contributing to long COVID, what's the context for that observation?
Yeah.
I mean, SARS-CoV-2, that statement is untrue in deer and cats, both of which are carriers for SARS-CoV-2. So how do we capture context, and how do you keep people from making up their own words? How many different ways are there to say SARS-CoV-2?
Yeah.
Right. So, there's literally hundreds in use currently. So how are you going to impose that these terms are chosen from ontologies? That can do something along the lines of, well, long COVID is defined as a human disease, so you don't need a context for it.
Yeah. So yeah, I love this question. So let me explain a little bit more about this, and then I'd love to hear your take, because this is something that is sort of an ongoing struggle, right? And as you're mentioning, it's a trade-off, right? The more freedom you give to the users, the shittier the data is. And so, and this is a battle that I'm really interested in getting in the middle of and figuring out like where to draw that line and how to push it. Because basically the way I see us is, I love us to be in the situation where on the side of the author, we want this to be author friendly, but pushing them as far as we possibly can into the structured realm. Okay, so in the ideal situation, we're pulling from ontologies. And so we're constraining, like, okay, let's say they start typing in like SARS-CoV-2, but like spelled differently or without the hyphen, like they're having to pick from a dropdown and it's pulling from an ontology. So that would be the ideal case. That's for the ontology thing. And then in terms of the context, so the way that we're approaching context is, so down below I have like, I just wrote key value pair, but essentially what that is what is the context? And that is actually really, really important for the claim being accurate, as you mentioned, but also for the co-visualization, right? So I think a lot of times what happens in articles is people are in English making a claim, and then there is kind of context and hand waving in there. But then when you go to arguing with people, you go back to that claim and then you're forgetting a lot of those details. And so, for example, like the animal models, right? Like if that is part of that metadata, and then you're co-visualizing it, and then the x-axis can be toggled for like, what is the animal model? Then you all of a sudden see like, oh, this is the result, like all these dots over here in mice, and it's totally different in monkeys. And so,
or this is the result in vivo, and this is a result in vitro.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and that's a tag. That's the kind of a tag that every single one of these triples has to have associated with. Is this in vivo or is this in vitro?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And there, I
absolutely.
think there's a fairly short list of, what's the species for a biological domain? What's the
Mhm.
species? What's the organ, tissue, cell? What's the biological context? Cell
Mhm.
proliferation, tumor growth, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And then structured names for every named item. If you're going to talk about a cell, you have to give the structured name for the cell. If you're going to talk
Right.
about a drug or a protein,
Mhm.
you have to you have to have, you got to pick those terms from an ontology. Otherwise, the idea that at some point you're going to be able to walk these trees of these RDF
Yeah.
trees is
Yeah.
just going to break down so quickly that,
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
going to work.
And I think
Oh, can I just add to this? Sorry,
Sure. No, go for it.
because I think this is headed in the right direction. I would almost say, given the issues with reproducibility of experiments, whether they're computational or wet lab experiments, you have to actually not just the cell culture in vivo versus in vitro or what kind of cells, but really the protocol, the
Mhm.
experimental, because the environmental conditions, the concentrations of drugs or the concentrations of different co-stimuli obviously are very important as well. And so I wonder if you actually need to require a protocol to be uploaded as part of the claim for reproducibility.
So right now we're imagining that protocol being down as like a referenced link. But I think if you have good peer review, right, where if the community is like intent and they will actually reject a micropub if there isn't a sufficient protocol. And so, and specifically, we nudge authors towards not just like a method section, but go and link to protocols.io or your actual protocols as opposed to like a method section, because it's a link, right? So it can be as long as you want it to be, just get the protocols in there. Somebody had mentioned kind of automation of some of this. I think that once we kind of reach a certain level and we have, to be frank, more money for different more developers and things like that, I think we can actually build some really interesting automation workflows where we're going in and doing some extraction from protocols, and like we just kind of know like, okay, these are details that probably should be in here. The author didn't put them in there, but we're going to shove them in there for them and do some of that sort of stuff. Another situation that I love thinking about, that we've never been in this situation, but I think it's really interesting to think through as like a thought experiment is, okay, let's say you have, so let's take the example of like infection fatality rate, like point estimates. Let's say everybody is publishing their point estimates, and there's really clear, there's a bimodal distribution of it, and you don't know why. You're looking through all the parameters that people have like included in their claims, and you just don't know what the hell is going on, but there's clearly a bimodal distribution. And we haven't figured out a workflow for this yet, but I down the road want to create a process by which you can then go back to the authors and say, look, like there's something going on here and we need more information. We need to pull and get more parameters to try to figure out what's going on. And through that process, you could actually resolve why there is not consensus there by going back and getting additional parameters. And what's interesting to me about that is it's, like I said, we're on the author side of this. And so we want to ask for structured information when there's a strong incentive for it, right? And so by co-visualizing, by having this narrative, and by saying like, hey, look, like we're trying to figure out there's this thing going on, like what the hell's going on? That creates a really strong incentive structure for people to go back in and be like, well, what is going on? Like, why is I'm in this camp, like, why is my IFR like half of this one? And then so like you start pulling and like engaging that curiosity and engaging that, like, as opposed to just saying like, hey, like I'm doing this thing that nobody's saying, and like I just give me more structured data because it's going to make my project better. This is like a community engaging, interactive, dynamic process that's really providing motivation for why we need to get more parameters in there. So that would be like the dream situation where you're like, like kind of digging in and getting more and more and more to really resolve something. But yeah, to your point, just about the protocols, absolutely. We don't have that built in right now where we can pull in from the protocols, but just as part of this larger approach of really trying to engage researchers and making sure that the structure that we're asking to give them is incentivized in some way. So like, and even going back to the ontology, right? Like, why pick from the ontology? Well, I like my spelling of SARS-CoV-2. Well, if you don't pick from the ontology, it's not going to get co-visualized with the other results. It's like, and this is a thing that we're promoting on Twitter or whatever it is, right? And so like, you want to be part of that conversation, you got to use the right term to get into that conversation. And so there's a lot of kind of thinking around that, like how do you incentivize that structure and make it like this a good slippery slope towards more structure.
Well, one easy way to incentivize is to make it as easy as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So a person should be able to open up a web page, a tool, a latex template or something, and start typing, say SARS-CoV-2 and have it automatically go fetch that.
Yeah.
And then
yeah.
it should have a canned list of things. What species are you talking about? What organ are you talking about? What's the overarching go term? And at any one of those places, they can go, this is irrelevant, or I don't know, or maybe I'll come back and fill it in later. But to have those, these are the things that must be included, and make it, first of all, make it obvious what they are. And second of all, make it as easy as possible to actually fill those things in.
Yeah.
So there's no ambiguity about what is being asked for in a particular place. I mean, a latex template would be really cool. And I'm sure some whiz-bang Python person could write a latex template that actually, could do a bioportal lookup, for example.
Huh.
Right.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that. Yeah, so let me I'll dig into that a little. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, this issue of how do you do automated annotation, or at least simplify annotation to reference databases and ontologies, is something that people in this community have thought about a lot. We haven't achieved it as much. I mean, Tom has worked on this and has it implemented in some of his software. But in general, it's not something that it's something we dream of but don't have. So I think there's a lot of interest in it.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I mean, I think this is not just in science, it's just in general. People are trying to figure out how to get more structured data. Like, I mean, there's all the stuff with the semantic web, and it basically failed. It's a very fundamental challenge, but I think it's a fight worth fighting, because there's a lot of promise at the end of that road.
Sorry, Lucas, and then Tom, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Nate, for the great overview. Like a few weeks ago, I remember that I briefly mentioned, or that we briefly talked about other micropublishing platforms, but I still can you maybe comment a bit on that? Like, what are other platforms? What is their focus, and how do they distinguish themselves, or how do you distinguish yourself from these other platforms?
So micropublications are something that have been talked about for a very, very long time, like since the 70s. And so you sort of have this like wave of interest, and then kind of a wave of failures, and then then people kind of come back. And so there was a big wave of interest, I think, like five years ago about. And so one of the there was one called Science Matters. They, I think, are not really operational anymore. The other big one is micropublication.org. They're really focused on a really specific community. So there's a group at Caltech that runs Wormbase, which is basically depositing. It's a database for depositing genotype-phenotype connections in C. elegans and other model organisms. And so they sort of had that existing community. And what was really cool about what they did is that they had a really tight relationship between the micropublication and then that structure that they needed to then deposit into a database that was very well used and highly visible. And so there was this really nice, seamless connection there, where people would micropublish, they'd provide a little bit of kind of description, context around it. And it was essentially padding around their database kind of insertion or uploading. So I think we're trying to expand into other fields of biology. I actually have not connected with them recently. It's been like a year or so. So that's one group that you should definitely check out. They're a little lower tech, and again, really kind of focused around the Wormbase thing. But like, if you take a broader perspective and include things that where the groups are not necessarily calling themselves micropublications, you then start seeing it in a lot of places. So that could be anything from Twitter threads, right? So like on Twitter, people are sharing original results, right? Like there's a discussion happening and they're saying, well, that's not what I found. Like, look at this, like, and like throwing data at each other. And that's really, really interesting. So that's not a micropublication per se, but those are, they call them cow paths, right? It's like cows just want to walk in a direction and they'll trample the grass, right? And so it's not like a road yet, but it's like user behavior that's going in a direction that to me is there's a very linear path between that and a micropublication. You also have things like the ensemble models I was talking about, where they weren't calling them micropublications, but individual researchers were collecting a bundle of scholarship and like sending that to somebody and like kind of publishing it on GitHub or whatever it was. And then it was getting reused in this larger kind of narrative. And so It kind of depends on your definition of micropublication, but I think the idea is out there. I think there's some really interesting trends towards that. But like people calling themselves micropublications, I think there's not a whole lot out there, and they kind of comes in waves. I think PLOS had something where they didn't call them micropublications, but they were calling them like briefer than brief communications. Like I forget what term they used were, but it was like they were trying to go further than brief communications, but they were essentially the same as just a regular article, is just shorter. I would say that where we really differentiate ourselves is that, and we haven't really proven this yet, this is like this is our trajectory, but is the micropublication is just the first step. It's actually relatively easy to constrain the word count, to constrain the figure count and the panels. What's very, very challenging, but also very, very exciting, and where my heart is how do you then do that research narrative and research storytelling? And so, and I think there are some groups where it's just, okay, like you're plugging it into knowledge graphs, but I think it has to be more than just some big open database that, and I don't know if I'm articulating this very well, but there's something between a database and just natural language, just a written description of what the narrative is, that is very compelling to me. And that's where we're inserting ourselves and trying to wrestle that to the ground, because I think that is going to be much more user friendly and engaging in terms of a community, and a community actually adopting this as a form of communicating their research than just I inserted it into a database, or I wrote up the article. And so I don't know if I'm articulating that very well, but it's that connecting of the micropubs into a compelling research narrative that can also importantly allow you to advance your career. So it's a little it's a less idealistic, this like focus on the career advancement, but I decided I don't want to change human nature, right? So humans are going to need to, make their labs more visible, make their work more visible, get grants, et cetera, et cetera. And so how can we do that, but in a way that's much more ethical and inclusive than what's currently happening with traditional journals? I don't know, Lucas, if that answer, it's sort of a shotgun approach.
No, it's perfect, because I also remember that I was reading about micropublications or micropublication.org, and I was just wondering if there are many more out there that I wasn't aware of. And I also remember that you had an eLife comment at some point where you discussed some of these ideas with other scientists, and I don't remember if they also started similar projects or not, but yeah, your answer was great. Thanks.
Tom?
Yeah, a couple of questions. So do you have a public API, or do these micropubs get the DOIs that could be cited in works?
Yeah, so this is, so yes, we have DOIs. I just recently was, from a technical perspective, thinking about actually pivoting away from DOIs, but I think yeah, so the first journal we did, Outbreak, which we had sunsetted, but that every single one of those had DOIs, and so you can reference them. There's some issues around like centralization with DOIs that I'm not totally comfortable with, but I think at least for the short term, each one will have DOIs. And so yeah, but the broader idea here is just, are we formalizing them into like actual scholarly articles that are going to be part of the scholarly, infrastructure? And so,
Well, for me, I'm imagining a really nice utility for it would be to be able to access these micropubs as pieces of evidence and annotations for my computational models. And so having access to a public API, or right now we're able to just grab whatever's behind a DOI. So that would be, if you don't have a public API, having DOIs would be the next easiest thing, actually.
Yeah, so DOIs, I mean, having a public API is definitely on the roadmap. So that taking that one step further though, part of we've kind of recently been experimenting and thinking through like Web3 type stuff and some of the blockchain stuff. And for me, one of the things that's really interesting there is that it's basically like a shared database. And so like, it's like almost like one step beyond a public API, where it's like, you don't even need me to be maintaining the API. It's like the Ethereum community is maintaining that API and that connection point into that stored database. And so some people kind of don't like Web3 stuff or the blockchain stuff, but a big part of our approach is how do we be more of a protocol and less of a platform, right? And so like one of the things that really bothers me and really motivated me to start working on these things is that basically the publishers right now control the database, right? And they can do all sorts of effed up things with it, right? They can put paywalls, they can do whatever. Journals really should be about formulating the content and formalizing it and getting it structured and maybe doing some like excitement and engagement around that content, but they absolutely should not be the library. And so I'm actually I have not found the right infrastructure for this yet, but I'm very interested in making sure that the content is very well stored, separate from us and an external platform. And ideally not in like an archival sort of way, but as in a version of record sort of way. So there's a robust community and APIs around engaging with that corpus that is pulling from a lot of different publishers. But yeah, DOIs and then having an API. We're pivoting right now. So we had some stuff for our first journal and a lot of that technology has actually gotten stale. So we're kind of actually we're in like kind of a technological drop right now where this data one's going to be a little bit more low tech, but then we'll be building up like the APIs and stuff like that. So I can keep you in the loop on that.
So, okay, and a second question. So how are you planning to sustain this?
Yeah, so business model. So there's a lot of options, but none of them are super, super compelling. So not to be too like transparent about all this, but you know, the initial idea was to try to push to get to a point where there was enough data to make like a data place. You could like do stuff with like, you know, if people needed custom APIs and things like that, you could charge for certain things, like have like a free tier. I don't know if we're gonna get there. A lot of other people, even big players like Web of Science, it's sometimes challenging to aggregate enough. And again, I'm not trying to be an aggregator, we're more a publisher. So a lot of where we're going to be looking for revenues are on that narrative storytelling above the micropublication. So if you wanted to build like a custom dashboard set of co-visualizations, there might be some pricing there. Maybe there's some turnkey options that are really easy for us to do that could be like $100 or something like that. And it's just like, we don't have to do any custom dev work. There could be other situations where there's a lot of custom dev work. So for example, like if like that Reich Lab wanted to redo that whole thing with the ensemble model, but use us instead of using their own developers, like maybe it'd be a third of the cost of what they spend on that. But we could do a lot of custom stuff for them within certain constraints. So that's one kind of whole line of potential revenues, which is keeping the publications free and keeping basic forms of that narrative storytelling and those data visualizations cheap or free, but then having kind of more custom and more complex stuff, having a pricing tier for that. The whole another direction involves this collaboration that I'm working on with this other org that I'm helping found, Science Fund, which is funder. And I think that there could be some really, really interesting ways to have either funders or industry sponsoring and supporting some of these things. So if you think of micropublications as a way to rapidly build up a knowledge base around a particular topic, that's essentially could be a very interesting service for a funder, right? So if they want to create a kind of a small focused topic on something and basically have us work with them to make sure that those micropublications are going into whatever their funding process is. So that could involve development work, but also just cross promotion. And that would be really exciting for me, because then we could basically not even really worry too much about the pricing on the publishing side, and we could just basically do more on that side for free, like in terms of those, like the custom visualizations and things like that. But it's still to be seen. Those are the two directions that we're feeling out. But we're still pre-revenue, so we don't have a lot of operating costs, but we're also not charging for anything. So we're feeling that out. Part of our founding principles is to not charge for the publication or the consumption of the content. And so I'm not really willing to cover, that's like really fundamental to kind of what we're doing. And so that does tie our hands a little bit, but at the same time, I think if we were charging for the micropublications, it wouldn't really work. It would sort of defeat the purpose of this, like if you're charging $1 per tweet, I mean, it kind of defeats the purpose of Twitter, you know what I mean? So but those are the two directions we're heading in for revenues.
Thanks, Nate.
Yeah.
Joel.
What did you say?
No, I just have a quick comment to do. Thank you very much, Nate. This is very interesting. I'm all for speed when it comes to proliferate ideas and everything. But we kind of walked through a little bit of questions about philosophical and ethical consequences of this platform, right? Or the widespread of this platform. And I wonder if you ever considered like the gamification of this strategy and how other people could use that in bad situations. For example, you can be working in a group that has the data being a proprietary thing. But then, as you said, the brick is not proprietary, right? How we deal with that in the sense of the whole system of promoting science as we have now.
Yeah, so I think this is also an arena where I would like to sort of like jump into. So you have things like preprints and other open platforms that basically anybody can kind of come in and pull onto. And I think that provides a really, really valuable service. But if you're now trying to be involved with, this like the storytelling and actually like the progress of science and evidence accumulation, I think you actually do need to step in and have either a strong editorial board or processes in place for handling those situations. And I think that it actually is part of the reason why I mentioned that that criteria for when something gets passes that threshold from being in review to accepted, leaving that almost deliberately a bit vague, at least as we get our feet under ourselves, because depending on the community, depending on the situation, you might need to actually have different criteria for that. And I think, I think the short answer is you can't actually, I don't know if I can actually prescribe a particular solution for something like that. But I think the fact that we are not going to be afraid to pull the trigger on taking things down or stepping in and being like, okay, hey, like this is not just like a free for all. We're actually trying to get to consensus. We're trying to be sensitive to people's careers, right? So if you're like stealing data and trying to publish it, like, and we figure that out, like we're going to block you from the platform, like that kind of stuff. And I think that goes towards building a brand that is associated with, or a community that is associated with getting it right, whether that's an ethical situation or scientific rigor or whatever it is. And so what that means in practice is that we're probably in the near future not going to be able to have a platform that is going to work for all fields everywhere, right? Like we're going to go kind of smaller community by community, which again is probably not the best for like the business model, but it's also, I think, the only way that you're going to solve these problems. I think the only way you're going to get this rapid communication and to not fail in the same way that people have failed in the past is to just go slowly and carefully and small and really like make it work within a particular community. So the data specifically though, which you mentioned, that is something that I don't quite have my head fully wrapped around. So I'd actually love if you had additional thoughts on that. I mean, I know there's like really sensitive data sets and to be fair, like I've actually kind of avoided certain fields where I knew that was going to be a big issue. And so, cause like, while I kind of like try to figure it out. So things like, if there's things that are going to be patented and like where there's a little like sensitivities around IP. I mean, we'll just have to kind of cross those bridges when we get there. But the data set one in particular is challenging because I define a publication as a fully public exposure of a thing that is whatever the scholarly work is. And so if you need to hide the data underlying that, I haven't quite come to a conclusion on whether that is a publication or maybe that should just be somewhere else. And when that data set is ready to be public and open, then it can be kind of linked to and included. I don't know. It's kind of tricky. I don't actually know where to land on that.
Because sometimes a method can, you can have an idea for a method after you analyze the data. So where that idea came from, right? It came from the data. And then you have all this discussion of, right?
Oh, in the provenance. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I kind of actually mistook your question a little bit. That is super interesting. And I think making sure, it's hard to do that. There's no one prescription for that. But I think that in general, you want the visibility of the different aspects of it to be on par, right? So I don't know if that's like how you're presenting things on the content on the site, or it's also could be just like outreach efforts, like making sure that it's like clear, like where provenance of the different ideas came from. There's a lot of other groups that are working on data publishing and making sure that the visibility and the career advancement of a data set is, but there's a lot of work to still do there. But I think even just things where you're like if somebody's linking to a data set and it's clear that well, making sure that they link to the data set, but then making sure that it's visible there. So it's not just like buried somewhere, but if it's clear that like, you know, these 10 micropublications, they're very much just like, there's this amazing data set and they're just like doing some stuff on top of it, making sure that that's clear and like increasing the visibility of it, or making sure it's really clear to see the link to go out to that data set. There's things like that to play with. But again, I think it's also, you want to be sensitive to the community. The community will understand the social dynamics here. And if somebody's like fucking with somebody else, and like making sure that you have processes for like being sensitive to that and then like addressing that situation as they come up.
Right. It's sad that I'm saying this, but sometimes the bureaucracy is kind of a way of limiting those kind of things, right? Because if you have to describe a methodology, for example, then you have to show everybody where that idea came from. If you cut that off, then it's like, okay, I can just publish something. Yeah, but anyway, it's very interesting. I'm all for, I hope it works. You know, I think we need more faster and more communal type of work in science too.
Yeah, and I guess just one last point there. My hypothesis is that if you have a more open, transparent, and specifically rapid process, there's less room for bureaucracy to be leveraged against other people, right? So like the fact that like you can have reviewer number 2 is like, oh shit, I like that idea, and like deliberately block that paper from going out, and nobody's seen it yet. Like it's a lot of times it hasn't even been pre-printed, and then they go do that, and then they get it out like as a preprint. Like just if the scope and the cycle is much smaller, it's just harder to do that, right? And especially if you're showing it like immediately, like the author has control of the visibility, like when it gets out like preprint. So yeah, that's my hypothesis, and I'm hoping that that's true because yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happens behind closed doors. Yeah.
Other questions? I have a couple, maybe
Sure.
too many, but I mean, to me, this I have a little bit of trouble mapping this model onto the way I do science, and it seems what you're talking about here is what I would call production science in large communities, where you have an established model of how the scientific process works in that community. You have established methodologies, and you can then define data sets, questions in a very clear way. I tend to work in more discovery science where nobody's done the things that I do before.
Yeah.
And so there isn't a pre-existing community. And there is, one of the reasons our papers tend to be so long is because nobody's ever done any of it.
Yeah.
And so we have to invent everything from scratch. And you would love to have a community that would help you build the pieces and put them together. But your model really only works because you're assuming that that community exists. And your worm base is a good example of that, I think.
So
and I'm not saying it's not useful. It's just I'm having to map that in my world. I'd love to be able to get to the point where we could use these kind of tools.
Yeah. So I would, if you don't mind, and maybe we could do this offline. I'd love to like, so one of the things that I do to help like think through this space is take a really specific example, like even a specific project, and like think through, could this be micropublished? How could it be micropublished? And yeah, so I'd love to do that with you if you're interested. But just in general about this idea of like new fields where there's not a lot there, part of the function that I see those data visualizations serving is actually, it's not just a one-way street where you have all the micropublications, there's a community there, and then you just like shove it in there and then that's the end. It's more of a process where you use the visualization to actually spark interest in that project and to then solicit micropublications. And specifically like, you know, like, okay, this is some parameter space that we haven't tackled yet. Like we need some people to go over there and like muck around over there and like do that. So you can kind of see those gaps. So having a system where you could seed one of those plots or whatever it is, and use that, and like we could like create, like really amplify the visibility of that to then use that as a tool to then pull people in to then micropublish additional stuff. That would be sort of an interesting goal. But in terms of like what you were describing where it doesn't map on very well, I've had that feedback as well before, where it's like a big model and you can't like publish a piece of the model. Is that also kind of your thing as well, where it's like,
well, if we designed our software better, you might be able to build modules that could be published this way. But modularity in the software is important for this to work. Otherwise, what you wind up with is something like basically your micropublication is basically an abstract.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, and
and
that's
you're
what we don't
sitting
want.
on 5,000 pages of supplemental material.
Yeah.
And you published your PNAS in 8 pages, and it's got 600 pages of supplemental material.
Yeah.
And then really you're not, I think, doing what you're trying to do, which is actually have the published material be meaningful. It may be you're referencing out to data sets and to methods, but you do want there to be something self-contained enough that it's not just an advertisement for the work, but actually contains the core of the work.
Exactly. Yeah. So one thing that keeps coming back for us is like whether we need to do vertical slicing or horizontal slicing. And so, and by that what I mean is like, so you could have like different people tackling, like using the exact same method, but in different like parameter spaces. But you could also like imagine like if you publish like an approach, like the method as like an approach, like before you even got to code, like, hey, this is the problem I'm trying to tackle, and I'm going to use this method. I don't know. So it's almost like a pre-registration. Yeah, I don't know if there could be like a way to do some like horizontal slicing there. But I guess maybe what I'd be curious about is, at any point in that process, do you feel that it would be helpful and interesting and exciting if you had more eyeballs on it and more people tinkering with it? And so I think if you could get there, there's probably a way we could do something with micropublishing. I would have to like think it through a little bit, but that's sort of the thought.
I mean, this has come up, the issues you're bringing up came up early in the history of this working group and led to a bit of a bust up where there were some collective efforts on some papers, and there was concern about allocation of credit, for example.
Yeah.
And I think legitimate ones. I mean, it wasn't. There were difficult issues.
Yeah, these are not. Yeah, they're not.
And on the forward direction, our dream has been to grow into a global alliance for immune digital twins, and trying to think about what would need to happen to make that possible. And there's an enormous amount of enabling technology in all sorts of different directions. And if one could subdivide the tasks of creating that community in a way that could be analyzed and built using the structures you're developing, I think that would be really fascinating and could be very, very productive.
Yeah, I'd love to keep chatting about how that could go. I don't think it's easy, and I think it's like you said, there's like a lot of these issues of like the credit and these sorts of things. But I think, like I said, I love workshopping different situations because it breaks down in different ways in different contexts. And so like that's also part of my process of mapping out how generalizable are parts of this, right? Like I think you're always going to need articles for certain things, you're always going to need books for certain things. And so like where exactly do micropubs like excel like beyond and like are just way better? And I think the larger the research effort is, like the more I think micropublications are going to be helpful to really structure that division of labor and to confer confidence that the provenance is going to be distributed correctly, and that we're going to be able to like, create that visibility to make sure that somebody's not like scooping and things like that. So I'd love to workshop some of the ideas that you have there.
I would love to talk to you more offline. I mean, I think there are many people who aren't here today who would be very interested in having this conversation. I was going to say there are two other small things I wanted to bring up. One was the issue of you're talking about reference out to data sets. But one of the things that we do a lot of in this world is software, is models, simulations. And one of the issues is running those simulations. And so we work with originally NSF-funded organization called NanoHub, which gives DOIs for small-scale computer simulations and free server time to anybody anywhere in the world. Now you have to register for it, so it's not that just a click and it runs. But the ability to actually be able, for example, in a micropublication, to be able to click and have it not only be able to have somebody else reproduce it, but have it reproduce. And I should be careful because it's replicate, not reproduce. But to be able to replicate the result live is something of value. Of course, it's expensive because somebody has to provide the servers. It has to provide persistence of that. But to us, that was quite interesting. In career development, when I teach courses, I have my students put up their little projects, even undergraduate students, put up their little projects on this server farm. They get a DOI for it. And it's been impressive how many people have wound up working for Facebook or Google based on their undergraduate class project that they put up, because there was, in fact, a persistent identifier. And in their CV, they could say, you can run it. You don't have to download it. You don't have to install software. You click here and it'll run. That's maybe a different kind of micropublication, and it's a little clunky because the NanoHub's been around for a long time.
I'll take a look at that.
Established earlier, but it does meet a need which I can't find anyplace else. Colab maybe, but Colab is, once it's Google, you have to worry about whether it'll continue.
No, that's super, super interesting. And we're with this journal we're trying to launch, we're actually specifically focusing on early career students, including undergraduates. So, and the reason we're actually doing that is because we want to scale down the incentives to the career advancement problem set. So it's easier to advance an undergraduate's career to placement in a lab or to graduate school than like a faculty getting an R01. So that example you gave is really interesting. I'm going to go check that out. Right now, my initial thought is to try to just partner with somebody or like nudge people towards platforms that already exist to do the code hosting. So like linking, just having a link. But I mean, down the road, if we have more capacity, I mean, that would be really, really cool. And the same thing with the data set too, right? Being able to just like interactively, just like dive very quickly from the content you're consuming to like, oh, okay, no, let me go fiddle with the code. And there could be also some small swings at that, where in some constrained ways we could do things like interactive figures where you can actually like fiddle with some of the parameters, not full like running the code, but kind of like a little bit of interaction.
Well, that's why I like Jupyter notebooks. I don't like them. There are a lot of things I hate about Jupyter notebooks, but as a publication medium, to have live simulations, you have your text and you have a figure, and that figure is a simulation. And you provide handles to that so that the person looking at that figure can manipulate in real time as it runs. Then if they want to, they can open up the code and actually dig into it, but they have the ability to control it live and see what it does. That kind of exploratory capability, I think, is very powerful. It takes a lot of work to deploy it, though. It's not easy to build a notebook that's useful. But when it's done right, it can be very valuable.
I mean, there's also an element of that with just like scientific rigor too, right? Like there's a lot, like a lot of, in my thesis, I had a lot of like color axis plots where you basically like, I mean, I felt like I had too much power. I was like, I can control the narrative based on where I set that threshold, right? I can make it look like a pinpoint, or I can make it look like a big mushroom cloud, depending on how I do like the colors and stuff. And I was like, and so being able to like go in and like do that yourself as the reader is very, very helpful to like really get a sense for where the truth is.
I mean, people like Herbert Sauer or Miriam have spent the years saying that every figure in every publication should be consist of the raw data plus a series of transformations to get the image. So that you have the entire workflow there. That in terms of scientific rigor, that's very valuable. In terms of the burden of publication, boy, does that put a lot of burden on the person doing the publication.
So and that's sort of like a constant thing that I think about. So like, there's this burden, right? And that goes with like the claims and the structured data, but then it also goes with like these figures and things like this, and making sure they have all their code up and stuff. But somebody earlier mentioned like this concept of a movement, and part of, I think, where I'm tapping into and hoping to grow is sort of a countercultural movement where it's actually like, instead of chasing the prestige, you like are like kind of like a bunch of like hard asses, and you're like chasing like the other direction, where it's like, how like small of a claim can I make and how intensely like rigorous can I be about it, and like just like really like almost like as a cultural statement, not giving a fuck about like how big of an impact this thing has, but being like super intense about like having all the code and all that stuff, and like having a community that's like brotherly competition or you know, sibling competition, where it's like you almost enjoy each other kind of like really rigorously, like, because you know that you're making each other tough and you're making the community tough. And so I'm not sure exactly how to make that all work, because it can get nasty if it's a too big of a community. But I think there's something there, right, where you can kind of create movements around like that scientific rigor, almost as like as another dimension of or a different direction, as opposed to like the traditional prestige and nature science stuff.
But providing workflow, one of the things that are missing are workflow tools to handle things like conceptual models, workflow tools to handle the process of taking data and turning it into a figure.
Yeah. So I mean,
these are, of course, it's expensive to produce those tools.
Yeah.
But having standardized tools that simplify these processes would be very valuable.
Yeah, you know, the closest I've gotten to that is like thinking about how to standardize the visualization of things, but more in terms of like helping authors, like once they kind of have the output and like kind of, I mean, this is what traditional publishers do anyways. It's like, okay, let's like work on the color scheme or whatever, just to kind of like communicate a little bit better. But I mean, if I got this core thing running, I could definitely see that as like a next tier out, which is like, how do we improve the data flows into things that are much more easily micropublished? You know, and especially if you think about like, if we're organizing a collaborative effort where you need standard models to then pool into this visualization, like, you know, the first step there is just like making sure they have the methods and the approaches and like disseminating that to them. But then a next step of that could be, oh, and actually we have like this tool that was built to help you run this or do that or whatever it is. Yeah, I like that idea. That's a very natural extension of what we're trying to do. But yeah, it requires resource and time and building and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, well, I've monopolized the floor for a while. Is there a final question for our speaker today? I think we've had a very good discussion.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, I want to thank you again so much. It was very stimulating. I hope you'll come back and talk with us again. I think there's a lot to explore here.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, happy to come back anytime.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow, others next week. And thank you again to our speaker.
All right, bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.